The evening air was thick with humidity as the sleek black sedan cruised down Jefferson Avenue. Behind the wheel sat Agent Taylor, a seasoned CIA operative who had just wrapped up 12 hours of intense surveillance. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the late hour, her mind was sharp as ever. The target she'd been tracking had finally led her team to what could be the biggest breakthrough in months. The digital clock on her dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when the first flash of red and blue lights painted her rearview mirror. Agent Taylor checked her speed, 62 in a 60 zone. She'd been careful, almost too careful, during her drive. 15 years of field experience had taught her to never draw unnecessary attention. She pulled over smoothly, positioning her car at a safe distance from the road. Her hands found their place at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained from both her CIA training and her father's lessons about being extra careful during traffic stops. The remembered sound of his voice brought a slight smile to her face. "Always keep your hands visible, baby girl. Always." Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer approach. His flashlight beam bounced with each step, creating dancing shadows on the pavement. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and a confident stride that spoke of someone relatively new to authority. "License and registration," the officer said, his flashlight beam sweeping across her face before moving to inspect the car's interior. Agent Taylor noticed how his other hand rested near his holster, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. "Good evening, officer," she replied, her voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer's posture shifted slightly. "You were weaving between lanes back there. Have you had anything to drink tonight?" Agent Taylor knew she hadn't been weaving. The surveillance equipment in her trunk had cost millions in taxpayer dollars, and she'd driven like she was transporting eggs on a bumpy road. But she also knew this game, had studied it, lived it, breathed it both as a black woman and as an intelligence officer. "No, sir. I haven't had anything to drink. I'm actually heading home from work." She kept her tone respectful but firm. The officer's flashlight beam lingered on her designer blazer, then moved to the expensive leather briefcase on her passenger seat. The contrast seemed to bother him. A black woman in an $80,000 car, dressed like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom, driving alone at night through this part of town. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Her heart rate picked up, but her face remained neutral. Inside that briefcase were classified documents that could compromise months of investigation if discovered. On her phone were encrypted messages about tomorrow's operation. Even her car's registration was under a CIA cover identity. As she carefully opened her door, she noticed a second patrol car pulling up. Standard procedure for many departments, but it complicated things. She could feel the weight of her CIA credentials in her jacket pocket. A simple flash of that shield would end this immediately. But protocol dictated otherwise. Revealing her identity could compromise not just her operation, but potentially other agents in the field. The first officer, she now saw his nameplate read Officer Chen, directed her toward the back of her car. "Have you been arrested before?" "No, sir." She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her where both officers could see them. The second officer, an older woman with graying hair at her temples, hung back by their patrol car, observing. "Mind telling me what you do for work?" Officer Chen asked, his tone suggesting he didn't expect a satisfactory answer. "I work in government consulting," she replied, the standard cover story that was both true and meaningless. "Government consulting," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words for lies. "And that requires you to be out this late." A dog barked in the distance, and Agent Taylor caught the faint sound of another siren, growing closer. This stop was escalating, and she needed to start thinking 3 moves ahead. The classified intel in her briefcase needed to reach Langley by morning. There were lives depending on it, but as she stood there, watching Officer Chen radio for a T9 unit, she noticed something that made her training kick into high gear. His questions weren't random. The way he kept glancing at her car's trunk, the specific mention of her job, this wasn't just racial profiling. Either by accident or design, Officer Chen was pulling on threads that led somewhere much bigger. The third patrol car rounded the corner, and Agent Taylor made a decision. Sometimes the best way to protect a secret was to reveal a different one. As the T9 unit pulled up, she began formulating a plan that would either salvage her operation or blow it sky high. What she didn't know was that this traffic stop was about to change not just her night, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could imagine. The real question wasn't about racial bias or police procedures, it was about what happened when two very different kinds of justice collided on a humid night on Jefferson Avenue. And in exactly 6 minutes, they were all going to find out. The T9 unit's arrival brought a new energy to the scene. Red and blue lights from 4 patrol cars now painted the street like a carnival gone wrong, drawing curious eyes from behind curtained windows of nearby homes. Agent Taylor watched as a German Shepherd emerged from the newest vehicle, its handler keeping it close on a short leash. A light drizzle had started, creating halos around the street lamps. Officer Chen stood talking with the K9 handler, their voices low but their body language speaking volumes. The female officer who'd arrived second was now reviewing Agent Taylor's license and registration, her expression giving nothing away. "Ma'am," the female officer called, walking over while still holding the documents. "Your registration shows this vehicle was purchased 3 months ago in cash." She left the question hanging in the air like the humidity around them. Agent Taylor nodded, knowing exactly how it looked. A $80,000 car bought in cash would raise flags in any police database. The truth, that it was a CIA motor pool vehicle, would clear everything up instantly. But that truth had to stay locked away, just like the classified files in her briefcase. "That's correct," she replied, maintaining eye contact. "I can provide the dealership information if you'd like to verify the purchase." The T9 handler was now walking the dog around her car in slow, deliberate circles. Agent Taylor felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, probably her handler wondering why she hadn't checked in yet. The operation she'd spent months building could unravel if she didn't make it to tomorrow morning's briefing with those files. "The dog's picking up something," Officer Chen called out, moving closer to her car. "Pop the trunk, please." Agent Taylor's mind raced through scenarios. The trunk contained surveillance equipment worth millions, disguised as ordinary luggage but still distinctly unusual. One look inside would raise more questions than answers. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I'd like to cooperate, but I need to make a phone call first." "A phone call?" Officer Chen's tone sharpened. "Ma'am, step back from the vehicle." That's when she noticed something that made her training kick in, the way Officer Chen kept glancing at his phone between questions. He wasn't just calling things in, he was checking something specific, something that had him on edge. The T9 handler had reached the passenger side door, and the dog was showing increased interest in her briefcase. Agent Taylor knew the next few moments would define everything that followed. "Officer Chen," she said, using his name deliberately, "I need 2 minutes with your supervisor." "Ma'am," hands where I can see them. His voice carried a new urgency. The female officer stepped forward, her hand moving to her belt. "Listen to him, ma'am. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Agent Taylor slowly raised her hands, but her mind was working overtime. The way Officer Chen had reacted to her government consulting comment earlier, his repeated checks of his phone, the unusually heavy response for a simple traffic stop, pieces were falling into place. "Your department's had a cyber breach, hasn't it?" she said quietly, directing her words to Officer Chen. His slight flinch told her everything. The local police department had been compromised, exactly the kind of thing her team had been tracking. The pieces suddenly clicked. The traffic stop wasn't random. They were looking for someone, and she fit a profile they'd been given. The T9 handler was now at her window, the dog intensely focused on her briefcase. The female officer had moved to her right, creating a triangle of authority around her. Time was running out. "Officer Chen," she said, her voice carrying a new weight, "I'm going to reach into my left jacket pocket very slowly. What you're about to see stays between us and your supervisor. Are we clear?" The tension in the air thickened. Officer Chen's hand stayed near his weapon, but he gave a slight nod. As she carefully reached for her CIA credentials, a new set of headlights turned onto Jefferson Avenue. Through the rain, she could make out an unmarked Crown Victoria, probably a detective or senior officer responding to the scene. What happened next would either salvage months of work or blow an international investigation wide open. The classified files in her briefcase weren't just papers, they were pieces of a puzzle that might explain exactly why Officer Chen's department was dealing with cyber attacks. The Crown Victoria parked, and a figure stepped out into the rain. Agent Taylor took a deep breath, knowing that sometimes the best way forward was straight through the storm. The real question wasn't about who had the authority here, it was about who had the bigger picture. And in the next few minutes, everyone present was going to learn just how deep this rabbit hole went. The figure stepping out of the Crown Victoria moved with the unmistakable authority of someone used to taking charge. Through the rain, Agent Taylor could make out the silver hair and weathered face of a man who'd probably spent decades on the force. His badge caught the flashing lights as he approached. "Lieutenant." "What do we have here?" His voice was deep, carrying easily over the sound of rain hitting patrol car roofs. Officer Chen straightened up. "Traffic stop that escalated, sir." Subject was weaving between lanes, showed suspicious behavior. K9 units indicating something in the vehicle. The lieutenant's eyes moved from Officer Chen to Agent Taylor, then to the expensive car behind her. His expression gave nothing away, but Agent Taylor noticed how he took in every detail of the scene: the multiple patrol cars, the gathering crowd of neighbors, the way his officers had positioned themselves. "Ma'am," he addressed her directly, "my officers tell me you were about to show some identification." Agent Taylor nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. But before I do, I need to know what happened to your department's computer systems last Tuesday." The lieutenant's poker face was good, but not perfect. A slight tightening around his eyes told her she hit the mark. Behind him, Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably. "That information isn't public," the lieutenant said carefully. "No," Agent Taylor agreed, "it isn't. Just like the similar attacks on 3 other police departments in neighboring counties aren't public, or the pattern of data breaches that's been moving east across the state." Now she had everyone's complete attention. The female officer had stopped writing in her notebook. Even the K9 handler was watching the exchange with new interest. "Ma'am," the lieutenant's voice had dropped lower, "who exactly are you?" The rain was falling harder now, running down the back of her neck. Agent Taylor thought about the files in her briefcase, about the months of surveillance that had led to this moment. Sometimes the best way to protect a secret was to reveal just enough truth to change the game. "Sir, what I'm about to show you cannot be logged in any official report. No phones, no body cameras, no dash cams. What happens in the next 5 minutes stays between us." The lieutenant studied her for a long moment, then turned to his officers. "Turn off the cameras. All of them." "But sir," Officer Chen started to protest. "Now." There was a series of beeps as cameras were deactivated. Agent Taylor waited until the lieutenant nodded, then slowly reached into her jacket. The leather wallet felt heavy as she pulled it out, its gold shield catching the red and blue lights as she held it up. The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly, just enough to show he understood the full weight of what he was seeing. He stepped closer, examining the credentials with careful attention. "Well," he said finally, "this complicates things." "Sir," Officer Chen interjected, "the K9 unit is still indicating." "Officer," the lieutenant cut him off, "step back to your vehicle. All of you give us the scene." The other officers hesitated but followed orders, retreating to their patrol cars. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of privacy around Agent Taylor and the lieutenant. "You said Tuesday," he spoke quietly once they were alone. "How did you know?" "Because that's what they want us to focus on," she replied. "The cyber attack is a distraction. Your department isn't the target, it's what's coming through your jurisdiction tomorrow night." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "The shipment on the interstate." Agent Taylor nodded. "They needed to blind your surveillance capabilities first. The data breach wasn't random, it was preparation." The lieutenant ran a hand over his face, brushing away rainwater. "We've got state police coordinating highway security, if what you're saying is true." "It's worse than you think," she cut in. "The state police task force was compromised 2 weeks ago. That's what's in my briefcase, proof that someone on their team is working with the other side." A crack of thunder rolled overhead, as if underlining the gravity of her words. The lieutenant looked at the patrol cars where his officers waited, then back at Agent Taylor. "If I let you go now, how do I know you'll keep me in the loop?" Agent Taylor smiled slightly. Because in about 6 hours, your cyber team is going to find a very specific backdoor in your systems. When they do, they'll need someone who knows what they're really looking at. The lieutenant nodded slowly, understanding the offer embedded in her words. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore, it was about something much bigger. "Officer Chen," he called out, "release the scene. Our visitor needs to be on her way." As the patrol cars began pulling away one by one, the lieutenant handed back her credentials. "Whatever's going down tomorrow night," he said quietly, "watch your back. Not everyone wearing a badge is on the same side." Agent Taylor took one last look at Officer Chen, who was watching her with a mix of confusion and dawning realization. Sometimes the biggest revelations came from the smallest moments, a routine traffic stop that pulled back the curtain on something far more dangerous. As she got back into her car, she knew that tomorrow would change everything. The real question wasn't about what was in her briefcase anymore, it was about who would be left standing when all the truth came out. Dawn was breaking over the city when Agent Taylor walked into the police department's cyber unit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she was led through a maze of cubicles by Officer Chen, who hadn't said a word since picking her up from the coffee shop across the street. His silence spoke volumes about how his worldview had shifted since last night's traffic stop. The lieutenant was waiting in the server room, along with a young woman with bright eyes and a collection of energy drink cans on her desk. The woman's fingers never stopped moving across her keyboard, even as she glanced up at their arrival. "Found it," the woman said without preamble. "Just like you said, buried in our firewall code, never seen anything like it." Agent Taylor set her briefcase on a clear spot of desk. "Show me." The screen filled with lines of code, and the woman, who introduced herself as the department's lead cyber analyst, pointed to a particular section. "See this? It's elegant. Whoever wrote this knows our systems inside and out. They didn't just break in, they walked through the front door with keys." "Because someone gave them those keys," Agent Taylor said quietly. She pulled out her laptop, connecting it to a secure satellite uplink. "Cross-reference this with what I'm about to show you." The files from her briefcase painted a disturbing picture. For months, similar breaches had been reported across the state. Each one preceded a major shipment of something passing through that jurisdiction: drugs, weapons, human trafficking. But no one had connected the dots because the departments couldn't share data after their systems were compromised. "Look at the pattern," she explained, pulling up a map. "Every breach, every shipment, they all follow the same highway corridor. Your department wasn't random, you're next in line." The lieutenant leaned closer to the screen. "The State Police Task Force is compromised," Agent Taylor finished, "but not at the top. Someone in their cyber division has been selling access. That's why they always know exactly when and where to hit." Officer Chen, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Last night, when the Key 9 unit was indicating something in your car." "Encrypted hard drives," she nodded. "With proof of who's been selling police access codes, but I couldn't reveal that during a traffic stop without compromising months of surveillance." The cyber analyst whistled low. "So when we were chasing digital ghosts, you were following the money." "Money, communications, travel patterns." Agent Taylor pulled up another file. "Your department's breach was different, though. They got sloppy, left traces. Maybe because they're getting confident, maybe because they're in a hurry. Either way, it's our chance to catch them." The lieutenant rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The shipment's supposed to come through tonight. State Police already has their checkpoint locations planned." "Locations that the criminals already know about," Agent Taylor pointed out. "Because they have access to the planning system." The cyber analyst's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Wait, look at this. The breach in our system. It's active right now. Someone's accessing our traffic camera network." Everyone crowded around her screen. Lines of code scrolled past, showing real-time intrusion into the department's surveillance systems. "They're not just watching," Officer Chen said, his police instincts kicking in. "They're setting up blind spots, places where their vehicles can slip through without being seen." Agent Taylor nodded. "Standard CIA tactic, create a corridor of darkness. Except they're using it to smuggle contraband instead of moving agents." The lieutenant straightened up. "So what's our play?" "We let them think their plan is working," Agent Taylor said, pulling up a satellite map of the city. But first, we need to contact someone I trust in the state police. Someone above the cyber division who can help us set a trap. The cyber analyst raised an eyebrow. You want to catch them in the act? Better than that, Agent Taylor smiled. We're going to let them catch themselves. Officer Chen, remember how you found me last night? The profile they gave you of a suspicious vehicle. Officer Chen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. They're using our own profiling systems against us, making sure any real law enforcement gets stopped before they can interfere. Exactly. But now we can use that against them. Your cyber analyst here can help us modify their access, feed them what we want them to see, make them think their plan is working perfectly. The lieutenant's phone buzzed, a message from state police about the evening's checkpoint operations. He showed it to Agent Taylor, who studied it carefully. Perfect timing, she said. They're about to walk right into their own trap. But first, we need to have a very interesting conversation with your state police contact. As the others huddled around the computer, planning their next moves, Agent Taylor watched the sun rise through the office window. Sometimes justice wore a badge, sometimes it carried a CIA shield, but today it would wear both. The real question wasn't about catching the bad guys anymore, it was about how many dominoes would fall when they did. The cyber analyst looked up from her screen. We're ready to begin. Agent Taylor nodded. Then let's show them what happens when they underestimate the people they profile. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police department's parking lot as final preparations were made. Agent Taylor watched from the second-floor window as Officer Chen supervised the positioning of unmarked vehicles. They had 6 hours until the shipment was supposed to come through, and every minute counted. Your state police contact is here, the lieutenant said from behind her. She turned to see a tall man in a crisp uniform entering the office. Captain Richards of the State Police Organized Crime Division looked exactly like his file photo, straight-backed, clear-eyed, and carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. I've been briefed, he said without preamble, but I'd like to hear it from you directly. Agent Taylor gestured to the evidence wall they'd assembled. Photos, maps, and connection charts covered every inch of space, telling a story of corruption and calculated criminal enterprise. Someone in your cyber division has been selling access to police databases across the state, she explained. They're not just breaching systems, they're using law enforcement's own protocols against us. Traffic stops, checkpoint locations, patrol patterns, all compromised. The captain studied the map, his jaw tightening. And tonight's shipment is bigger than anything they've moved before, she continued, pulling up satellite imagery. They've created a perfect corridor using our own blind spots. State police checkpoints are positioned exactly where they want them because they helped place them there. The cyber analyst, who hadn't left her computer since morning, called out. They're in the system again, checking camera feeds along the route. Everyone gathered around her screen. The intrusion was bold, almost arrogant in its thoroughness. Whoever was behind it wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Watch this, the analyst said, fingers flying across her keyboard. They think they're seeing real-time footage, but she hit a key, and the feeds shifted slightly. We're now feeding them exactly what they expect to see. Captain Richards leaned closer. How long can you maintain that? Long enough, Agent Taylor answered. The real question is whether you're ready for what happens next. When we spring this trap, it's going to implicate people you know, people you've worked with. The captain straightened up, his expression hard. Agent, I've spent 23 years building my division. If someone's corrupted it, I want them taken down. All of them. Officer Chen entered the room, slightly out of breath. Unmarked units are in position. We've got plainclothes officers setting up at all the alternative routes. The lieutenant nodded approvingly. Good, now we wait for them to make their move. Agent Taylor's phone buzzed. A message from her CIA handlers confirming satellite coverage for the operation. Everything was falling into place, but something was nagging at her instincts. The setup felt almost too perfect. Captain, she said suddenly, who else knows you're here? He looked at her sharply. Just my direct superior. Why? She moved to the window, scanning the parking lot. Because if I were running their operation, I'd have someone watching the police department. And if I saw a state police captain walking in. The cyber analyst's voice cut through the room. We've got movement. Multiple vehicles just pinged our modified camera system. They're starting early. The room erupted into action. Officer Chen was already on his radio, alerting the unmarked units. The lieutenant grabbed his keys, heading for the door. "Wait," Agent Taylor called out. "Look at the pattern. These vehicles, they're not trying to avoid detection. They're drawing attention. This is a diversion." The captain's face darkened with understanding. "While we chase these decoys, the real shipment takes a completely different route," she finished. "One we haven't even considered because it wasn't in any of their planning documents." The cyber analyst's fingers were a blow on her keyboard. "The system breach, it's not just checking cameras anymore. They're accessing patrol assignments from 3 weeks ago." Agent Taylor moved to the map, her mind racing. They didn't just plan for tonight. They've been laying groundwork for weeks, creating a pattern of patrol car movements that looks random but actually creates a gap, Officer Chen said, pointing to a section of the map. "Right here. An area that looks well patrolled on paper but actually has predictable blind spots." The lieutenant was already pulling up historical patrol data. "He's right. Look at the rotation patterns. They've been subtly manipulating our patrol schedules for weeks, making small adjustments that add up to a perfect window of opportunity," Agent Taylor finished. "Captain, what's in that sector?" The captain studied the map, his face going pale. "The old rail yard. It's been abandoned for years, but the tracks, they connect directly to the interstate transport system." The cyber analyst looked up from her screen. "Should I alert all units to converge there?" "No," Agent Taylor said firmly. "That's exactly what they'll be watching for. If we suddenly redirect all our resources, they'll know we're onto them." She turned to Officer Chen. "Remember last night when you pulled me over? Sometimes the best way to catch someone is to let them think they're the ones in control." The lieutenant caught her meaning. "We make them think their diversion is working." "Exactly. Captain, I need you to very publicly coordinate the response to those decoy vehicles. Make it look good. Meanwhile," she turned to Officer Chen and the cyber analyst, "how do you feel about a little late-night stakeout at an abandoned rail yard?" As the room buzzed with renewed purpose, Agent Taylor felt the pieces falling into place. Sometimes the biggest victories came not from overwhelming force, but from letting your opponent think they'd already won. The real question wasn't about catching a shipment anymore. It was about unraveling an entire network that had infected law enforcement from the inside out. And it all started with a simple traffic stop that proved appearances could be deceiving in more ways than one. The abandoned rail yard lay silent under a blanket of darkness, its rusty tracks gleaming dully in the moonlight. Agent Taylor crouched behind a weathered shipping container, Officer Chen at her side. The cyber analyst's voice crackled softly in their earpieces, monitoring police channels from a surveillance van parked 2 blocks away. "Decoy vehicles are keeping everyone busy on the interstate," she reported. "Captain Richards is putting on quite a show. You should see the news helicopters." Agent Taylor checked her watch, 11:42 p.m. If their analysis was right, the real action would start soon. The rail yard seemed deserted, but years of CIA training had taught her that appearances were often deceiving. "Movement at the south entrance," Officer Chen whispered, pointing to a shadow that seemed darker than the others. A moment later, they heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel. The vehicle moved slowly, lights off, using the old loading dock for cover. It was followed by another, then another, 3 unmarked box trucks moving with practiced precision. "They're not even trying to look legitimate," Officer Chen muttered. "No company logos, blacked out windows." "That's because they don't expect anyone to be watching," Agent Taylor replied softly. "According to all official channels, every available unit is chasing their decoys on the highway." The trucks parked in a triangle formation near an old warehouse. Men emerged from the vehicles, moving with military efficiency. One carried what looked like sophisticated electronic equipment. "They're scanning for surveillance," Agent Taylor noted. "Stay absolutely still." Through her night vision scope, she counted 12 men. Their movements suggested professional training. These weren't ordinary criminals. Based at Alpha, the cyber analyst's voice whispered in their ears. "You need to see this," patching through a video feed. Agent Taylor pulled out her secure tablet, Officer Chen leaning in to watch. The screen showed grainy security camera footage from the state police headquarters, timestamped just 10 minutes ago. "That's Lieutenant Ross from Cyber Division," Officer Chen breathed. "He's supposed to be coordinating the highway operation." They watched as the lieutenant moved through the building, entering restricted areas with his security clearance. He went straight to the main server room, plugged in a device, and began downloading files. "He's covering their tracks," Agent Taylor realized. "Erasing evidence of the system breaches once the shipment is through." But why now? Officer Chen wondered. Why not wait until? He was cut off by the sound of approaching vehicles, more of them this time. Heavy engines, the kind used in industrial transport. 2 semi-trucks backed into the loading area, their trailers bearing legitimate shipping company logos. A perfect front for moving contraband. "Clever," Agent Taylor murmured. "The box trucks are bringing whatever they're smuggling, and these legitimate trucks will take it to its final destination. Hidden in plain sight among real cargo." The cyber analyst's voice crackled urgently. "Multiple hits on facial recognition. These guys, they're not just criminals. I'm seeing former military, private security contractors, even a few ex-law enforcement." Agent Taylor watched as the men began efficiently transferring crates from the box trucks to the semi-trailers. Their operation was well-rehearsed, professional. "We can't take them head-on," Officer Chen said. "Even if we called in backup now, they'd be gone before anyone arrived." "We don't need to," Agent Taylor replied, a plan forming. "Look at their setup. They're so confident in their cyber coverage that they've only posted 2 lookouts." She pointed to where 2 men stood guard, one at each end of the yard. Their attention was focused outward, watching for approaching vehicles or patrol cars. "The lieutenant's about to finish in the server room," the cyber analyst reported. "Once he does, they'll think they're completely clean," Agent Taylor finished. "That's when we let them know just how wrong they are." She pulled out her phone, sending a coded signal. Moments later, they heard the distant sound of police sirens, but not coming toward them. "Listen," she whispered to Officer Chen. "The patrol cars are moving away from this area. As far as their lookouts are concerned, the police presence is decreasing exactly like their data predicted," he finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. The loading operation picked up speed. The men clearly thought their window of opportunity was opening exactly as planned. That's when Agent Taylor's phone lit up with a message from Captain Richards, "Package delivered. Standing by." She smiled in the darkness. While Lieutenant Ross had been busy erasing files, the captain had been implementing the next phase of their plan. Sometimes the best trap was the one your target didn't even know to look for. "Get ready," she told Officer Chen. "When I give the signal, your only job is to block the south exit. Don't engage them directly." He nodded, his hands steady on his weapon. "What about the rest?" "Watch," she said simply. The loading was almost complete when one of the lookouts suddenly stiffened. He raised his radio, but before he could speak, floodlights blazed to life from every direction. They hadn't come from police cars or helicopters. They'd been pre-positioned in the surrounding buildings, waiting for this moment. The legitimate-looking semi-trucks suddenly roared to life, but not to escape. Their trailers opened to reveal tactical teams from 3 different agencies, all with weapons trained on the stunned criminals. "You see," Agent Taylor said, as chaos erupted below, "sometimes the best way to catch someone isn't to chase them at all. It's to become part of their plan without them ever knowing it." The night exploded into action, but the outcome was already decided. Sometimes justice wore a badge, sometimes it carried a CIA shield, and sometimes it drove a truck with a shipping company logo. The real question wasn't about who would win anymore. It was about how many layers of corruption they'd uncover when the dust finally settled. 3 weeks after the raid at the rail yard, Agent Taylor sat in the police department's conference room, watching the morning sun stream through the windows. The room was filled with officers, state police officials, and federal agents, all gathered for the final briefing on what had become one of the largest corruption investigations in the state's history. The lieutenant stood at the front of the room, pointing to a screen filled with photos and connection charts. "Thanks to the evidence we gathered that night, we've identified 37 corrupt officials across 12 departments. The network went deeper than anyone imagined." Officer Chen, now wearing a detective's badge, added, "The cyber breach was just the tip of the iceberg." They'd been placing people in key positions for years, building a shadow network inside law enforcement. The cyber analyst, who'd earned a commendation for her role in the operation, pulled up a new set of data. The technology they used to breach our systems came from military-grade sources. They weren't just criminals. They were funded by international organizations trying to establish smuggling routes through our jurisdiction. Captain Richards stepped forward. Lieutenant Ross and his accomplices in the cyber division have been arrested. They're cooperating with federal investigators, helping us uncover similar operations in other states. Agent Taylor watched the presentation with quiet satisfaction. The case had started with a simple traffic stop, one that could have gone very differently if Officer Chen hadn't followed his instincts, if the lieutenant hadn't been willing to listen, if the cyber analyst hadn't been sharp enough to spot the patterns. The really clever part, the cyber analyst continued, was how they use our own profiling systems against us. They created specific alerts and profiles designed to divert attention away from their operations. Like that night with Agent Taylor's car. Officer Chen caught Agent Taylor's eye across the room, sharing a knowing look. What had started as potential racial profiling had transformed into something much more significant, a lesson about appearances, assumptions, and the importance of looking deeper. The briefing continued with details about the seized contraband, weapons, drugs, and evidence of human trafficking operations that had been disrupted. But more importantly, that exposed a vulnerability in how law enforcement agencies shared information and vetted their personnel. After the formal presentation, Agent Taylor found herself in the break room with Officer Chen and the cyber analyst. The coffee wasn't great, but the company made up for it. "So what happens now?" the analyst asked, stirring sugar into her cup. "Changes," Agent Taylor replied. "New protocols for inter-agency communication, better oversight of cyber divisions, training programs to help officers recognize signs of internal corruption." Officer Chen nodded. "And new guidelines for traffic stops. No more relying solely on automated alerts or profiles. We're retraining every officer to question not just suspicious behavior, but suspicious patterns in our own systems." "Speaking of changes," the analyst grinned. "Heard about your promotion, Detective Chen. Seems like that night made quite an impression on the brass." Before he could respond, Captain Richards appeared in the doorway. "Agent Taylor, got a minute?" They walked to his office, where he closed the door. "Just got word from the federal task force. They're expanding the investigation to 3 more states. Looks like our operation exposed similar networks across the region." Agent Taylor wasn't surprised. Criminal enterprises this sophisticated rarely limited themselves to one jurisdiction. They'll need good people to run those investigations. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you," the captain said. "The task force is creating a new division, specifically focused on identifying corruption inside law enforcement. They need someone who understands both sides of the badge, someone who can bridge the gap between agencies." She raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you offering me a job, Captain?" "More like a partnership. Your CIA experience, combined with what we learned from this case, we could make real changes. Stop these infiltrations before they take root." Agent Taylor thought about it. She'd seen firsthand how corruption could poison the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. But she also seen how good officers, when given the right tools and support, could make a real difference. "I'll need to talk to my superiors," she said, "but I'm interested." The captain smiled. "Good, because we've already got our first case. Remember those military-grade cyber tools they were using? Turns out they came from a defense contractor with some interesting connections." As they discussed the details, Agent Taylor reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. A traffic stop that could have ended in confrontation had instead sparked a transformation. It wasn't just about catching bad guys anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, both within law enforcement and with the communities they served. Later that evening, as she left the police department, she passed Officer Chen, no, Detective Chen, heading out to his patrol car. Old habits died hard, even with the new badge. "You know," he called after her, "I never did apologize for that night." She turned back with a smile. "No need. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. Just make sure those changes stick." He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. As she walked to her car, Agent Taylor thought about all the other officers out there, all the other traffic stops happening right now. The real victory wasn't just in catching the criminals, it was in changing the system that had allowed them to flourish. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Sometimes justice wore a badge, sometimes it carried a CIA shield, but always, always, it required people willing to look past their first assumptions and see the bigger picture. The real question wasn't about what they'd accomplished, it was about what would happen next time someone was pulled over for suspicious behavior. And thanks to the changes they'd set in motion, that story might have a very different ending.